Hello, everyone. First of all, some initial information that this session is recorded and it will be available to all of you at the end. You will get an automatic email on this. Your microphone is automatically muted. Please, if you have any questions, please use the chat box on your screen of the webinar. We will have a number of polls coming up, so please try to reply to them in the time given, and then we will go over the questions, your answers actually. And with this, also, if we can go to the next slide, Geraldine. So we have also with us today Daniel Cantor. Some of you may have met him in the past. He will be ensuring that we are on the right path. He will be screening some of the questions. Thank you, Daniel, for being with us today. And fortunately or unfortunately for you, there will be no logistics to arrange at the same time that there will be no lunch breaks and no dinners at this MCC, the 16th edition, the COVID edition, let's say. So no safety briefings on this one. It's a different MCC. We are looking all forward to get over and have a live session with all of you next year. Thanks again for your participation. So just a very short words about the role of the MCC. Every year we're trying to have speakers from around the world, as this year, from airlines and vendors, suppliers to the industry and other industry stakeholders to provide you with their insights, especially in the area of maintenance costs. Maintenance costs, as we all know, is pretty highly up in the expenses of an airline, and they are actually getting even higher lately as we monitor. It is important to provide us with your data. So as you know, we are running the maintenance cost collection, the data collection. So please, there's still time to provide us with your data. And we are going to produce the report by the end of the year, as usually, as always. And this year will be important because we want to see what will be the changes to the industry coming up later. So it is very important that you provide us with your information. The IATA resources that there are available for all of you around COVID, you will have them in the last few slides of the webinar. And as I mentioned, we will run through the polls and the Q&A. A very short briefing about what is coming up in the next episodes, as we call it. So we run this MCC this year in a series of 4 webinars, 4 episodes, every Wednesday this time around the world, as one session to have all of you in one place. And the second one will be about transporting of cargo in the passenger cabin. What are the regulatory issues, the OEM issues, what airlines are doing. We will also discuss about aircraft disinfection and some of the what is acceptable and what are some airlines working on. And finally, we will discuss about the biocides that is needed to treat the fuel and how you can test the fuel and associated costs with these activities. In the third episode on September 23rd, we're going to talk about the impact to the aircraft leasing and to the MRO activities and how the COVID is going to reshape the business in the future. So we'll have speakers discussing those aspects of the business. And finally, in the last episode on the 30th of September, we'll discuss the role of used serviceable material in the industry restart, how this can be a tool to provide us some cost efficiency as we move forward. It is something that is expected as so many aircraft are parked, and we expect to see a number of teardowns and so forth. So with this, let's go quickly over the agenda of this webinar. So we will have our Chief Economist, Brian Pearce, providing us with an assessment of the industry and an outlook. And then we will have some prominent speakers from Eurowings, Virgin Australia, Ellinair, EasyJet, Southwest, and then we will follow with Q&A. After Brian's presentation, there will be a short Q&A for his part, and then we will continue at the end, after all the speakers, with a Q&A with all our panelists today. And we will wrap up in a couple of, in less than 2 hours from now. With this, let me introduce you to our speakers today. So first of all, we have Brian Pearce, our Chief Economist. Many of you have known him from past conferences and also from the forecasts that he provides to the industry and general IATA outlook. And then we will have our maintenance cost technical group chairman, Hannes Pferdekamper, who is the head of business development with Eurowings. He will be followed by the MCTG vice chairman, Keith Fernandes, who is the manager for the fleet engineering for Virgin Australia, so all over on the other part of the world where we are, at least. Thanos Pascalis will be next. He's the CEO of Ellinair, a regional smaller line in Europe. Swaran Sidhu will provide his insights as the head of fleet technical management with EasyJet, one of the largest low-cost, so-called low-cost carriers, and their aspects in this crisis and how they handle. And finally, we will have another low-cost carrier, Southwest from the Americas, Michael Hansen, manager of fleet strategy for Southwest. Thank you all for your participation and your insights. And with this, we will go to our first poll for you. And this is kind of trying to monitor your expectation. If you can give us an answer, when will demand for travel be back to the 2019 levels? Please select if you expect to see it in 6 to 12 months, 12 to 24 months, 2 to 3 years, or more than 3 years. So you have a few seconds to press and choose your option there that you see on the screen. Let's see what the outcome will be and how it may have changed from another poll we have taken with a similar group a couple of months ago. So should we have the results? Okay, so we have 9, 28, 39, and 24%. So as we have the results from the last poll, what I can tell you is that everybody is expecting to see this industry restart happening a little bit later. If you remember, in the last poll that we had in the mid of July, we polled 49% for 2 to 3 years and 16%. Now it's 39 and 24. So most of you, the other two actually are pretty tracking the same numbers. So there is more of a shift to the higher to a longer recovery for the industry. That's quite interesting. And with this said, I will pass it on to Brian. Brian, thanks for being with us today, and the floor is all yours. Thanks for participating with us.
Well, thank you, Chris, and good day to everybody. I'm going to present our assessment of where we think the industry is, and also, a view on the markets, which I think are not too far away from the views that you've expressed in terms of it being quite a slow process to see a full recovery of passenger traffic. I guess I wanted to start off, emphasising how important I think that what you're doing is, because it seems to us as though the airline industry is in a pretty fragile financial position, and I think this chart emphasises that we went into the crisis with really only about 30 or 40 airlines in really good shape. You can see here airlines ranked in order of profitability, and between 2008 2018 it was only 30 or 40 airlines that drove the improvement at the industry level. There's a long tail of airlines who are just about breaking even or loss making, and that was before the crisis. Next slide, please. And the same is true if we look at the balance sheet situation, and this is a common debt metric that credit rating agencies use. That group of airlines that drove the improvement over the last 5 to 10 years actually dramatically improved their balance sheets and got their debt down to investment grade levels. But unfortunately, that was much more of a challenge in the rest of the industry, where, as I say, before we entered this crisis, we saw debt something like 5 or 6 times earnings. Next slide, please. And of course, what we haven't seen so far are many failures of airlines. There are perhaps 30 or 40 airlines that have failed or are in bankruptcy protection, but that's a pretty small number. And of course, the reason being that the governments have stepped up. They provided $180 billion or so of aid and have kept the industry on life support. But we see the challenge as the industry starts operations again. That has left the industry with a lot of debt. Roughly half of that aid from governments was debt, as you can see by the black bars. And airlines, understandably, have been building up their cash war chests where they can by accessing capital markets. In total, we think the industry has added about $200 billion to its debt this year. It's probably not going to be sustainable for many. Next slide, please. Obviously, one of the big challenges has been that the passenger market has just collapsed, and many of the costs, even though fleets have been grounded, many costs just can't be avoided in the short term. They're fixed or semi-fixed, and so on average, we think the industry in the second quarter was operating at quite a substantial loss. But then, in addition to that, there have been very substantial amounts of unflown tickets that have needed to be refunded, perhaps $35 billion worth. The industry could have been burning through cash at a rate of about $60 billion in the second quarter. And as I said, without government aid, even the strong airlines would have foundered in this sort of environment. But I guess what we're focused on now is the restart and what financial and economic conditions are as we move into that. And if we go to the next slide, I think one of the challenges are basically the impact on costs of the health controls that are being put in place, which have reduced utilization, turnaround times, in some circumstances reduced the use of seats on aircraft. And we did this exercise here looking at what it would need to get the industry back to break even if it had to leave the middle seat empty. And you can see, without a dramatic rise in prices, that looks pretty tough. And if we move to the next slide, obviously a dramatic rise in prices is not what's happening at the moment. If we can move to the next slide, please. Because what we're seeing, particularly on domestic markets, where really that's where we're seeing travel recover, we're not really seeing very much happen on international markets. So those international fares aren't really representative of an open market. But clearly airlines are trying to stimulate demand, get passengers onto seats by low fares. 25% down. We know in the Chinese domestic market, average fares are down about 33%. So that's a sort of, without dramatically shrinking the cost base, that's a tricky environment in which to turn cash positive. And the next, if we go to the next slide, please. I think one of the challenges airlines are facing at the moment is that in many markets, passengers are booking much later than they would have done before. Last year and in the normal times, I think around about 40% of tickets would have been bought or booked more than 21 days ahead of the travel date. What we're finding today is that there's more than 40% of bookings taking place between 0 and 3 days ahead of the travel period. So clearly that makes it really difficult to schedule. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing, in effect, too much capacity being brought back given the weakness of demand. And looking ahead at bookings data and August and September based on the flights and the schedules data, that problem, that gap really represents cash burn. Is not going away. So I think there's a real challenge in making the situation cash positive. We could move on to the next slide, please. So consequently, our forecast, when we issued our forecast in the middle of the year, we looked at what we expected yields and unit costs to be, and break-even levels still look around about the mid 70% for passenger load factors. Now, obviously, if you've got wage subsidies at the moment from governments, that makes a big difference to that. But absent that, we sort of need to get load factors considerably higher than where they are today in order to break even. Next slide, please. But one bright spot is cargo. And although cargo volumes are down on where they were last year, you can see from the blue line, in July they were down about 13%. Clearly that's a lot better than international air travel, which was down 91% in July. And as you can see from the red line, export orders are actually looking pretty good. We think that things are set quite fair for reasonably good cargo traffic demand. But actually that's not what's driving the cargo business at the moment. If we move to the next slide, it's actually the much better yields that are coming about because of the rather dramatic shortage of capacity to carry cargo. Recall that in normal times, over 50% of cargo traffic is carried in the bellies of passenger aircraft, which, as you can see from the blue line there, the wide-bodied aircraft are starting to come back, but it's still pretty low compared to normal, and freighters are being very highly utilized in terms of their daily hours. So there's a limit to which capacity, we're partly dependent on the relaxation of travel restrictions to get the passenger fleet back and generating cargo capacity. So yields are probably going to stay quite firm. It's going to make a difference on some routes and for some airlines. Unfortunately, though, cargo is typically, in normal times, 15% of industry revenue, so not big enough to offset the collapse in passenger revenues. But let me go to the next slide. So I think what's driving cargo demand is what's happening in the economy outside of transport. And I think what's encouraging is that the unlocking of economies has led to a very sharp rise in the confidence of businesses, not airline businesses, but the average business, particularly manufacturers, the sort of people that drive air cargo. And that really points to more of a sort of V-shaped recovery in the wider economy, which I think is good news. But unfortunately, businesses are telling us that despite that, they're not traveling. And if we move to the next slide, we know that consumers are nowhere near as confident. And that's obviously the key for leisure travel. Moving to the next slide, what we've seen on air transport markets is, international travel remains locked down. July we saw a little bit of a rise, but it's still 91-92% down. There is more growth on domestic. And moving to the next slide, some markets like this Vietnamese market, this actually shows flights rather than RPKs, the blue line, but it shows that actually Vietnam had a full recovery of their domestic market by July. Unfortunately, the reappearance or second wave of COVID cases has knocked that on the head. So it does show that there's an appetite to fly again. I think our main challenge is with border controls. And next slide, please. Amongst those improving domestic markets, there is a lot of variation. The Chinese domestic market is looking actually in pretty good shape. 28% down on a year ago by July. Actually, airlines in China, seem to be not too far away from breaking even. Load factors in the mid-70s. But China's the exception. The US, Australia, much slower recoveries. The difference here is very highly correlated to the success or otherwise in controlling the virus. Low in China, rising in many other parts of the world, of course, including Europe at the moment. Next slide, please. Internationally, as you can see from the main markets there, North Pacific, North Atlantic, within Asia, virtually no recovery at all. The one area we're seeing international travel is within Europe, and because of the travel bubbles and corridors that some European states have agreed with each other. But and that is where we would see the growth of international travel. Intercontinental and long-haul travel probably going to be the last to recover, just because of the need to get governments to agree that they're not risking importing COVID. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that this was a situation for travel restrictions. We go to the next slide, please. This was a situation for travel restrictions 2nd of September. The darker, the more restrictive we are. As you can see, very little white on this. Most countries have got severe travel restrictions. Although they've unlocked their economies, they've not opened borders to international travel. We think, well, first of all, quarantine has proved to be equivalent to a full travel ban. People just won't fly. And we think the path forward is through an effective testing regime. But obviously we need something that gives rapid results, is widely available, not too expensive, and we're getting there, but I don't think we're quite there yet. If you could move past the next two slides to the last slide. That's it. So I'm just going to finish on this one, which I think is sort of fairly consistent with those survey results that or the poll results that you gave at the beginning. This is our view of global air travel RPKs. The blue line is our baseline forecast, and as you can see, we're expecting 2019 levels to be recovered by perhaps 23 or 2024. And as you can see, also compared to the pre-COVID expectation for travel markets, we're a long way below that dotted line, some 15% below that dotted line by the end of the period. So that's a sort of big loss of expected business. And as you can also see from that range of uncertainty, there's quite a downside as well to this. So I'll hand back to you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, for your insights. We'll have a few minutes for questions, I think about 5 minutes. So there are some questions that are posted for us. One question is about COVID and the industry decarbonization. I'm not sure if you have done any studies, or what are the views about the impact of COVID to the environmental efforts that the industry has been asked to participate in.
Well, I think after the global financial crisis, the recession in 2008, 2009, we actually saw environmental issues sort of go down the agenda. That will not happen this time. And some of the rescue packages have been linked to improved environmental performance. That will be a requirement for the industry, as we move into more normal times. I think one of the byproducts of the COVID crisis is that we'll see a lot of the, we desperately need to dramatically downsize our fleets and operations and costs. Clearly, that's going to take a lot of less efficient aircraft out of the fleet. So average fuel efficiency looks good. I think that will be improved. But ultimately, I think we need a new fuel. We need maybe electrification on short haul, certainly a sustainable fuel for long haul and elsewhere. And the challenge with that, I think, is that airlines just don't have the money to be able to finance that. They certainly don't have the money to be able to pay a premium over jet kerosene at the moment. So that's a problem to be solved.
Thank you, Brian. One other related question to the crisis. Many of the airlines are kind of kept in the business because of the packages that they have been provided through the government, the various governments around the world. Especially in the US, we saw a massive influx of cash into the business. In Europe, the governments are institutionalizing even packages to save the airlines. Of course, this is something that it will stop at some point. Money will run out. What is the expectation on this? Are they linking this? Yeah. Are we linking this to the recovery? What will happen? What are your views on this?
Well, I think we're already starting to see governments step away from support, particularly with the wage subsidies, and that's going to mean airlines are going to have to stand on their own feet. Unfortunately, the reality I think is going to be that some of that aid will drop away. We've seen balance sheet support, but it's actually operational cash flows that are the challenge today, with yields being so low and costs being higher because of low utilization rates. I think this winter period is going to be a really difficult one for the industry, and need all the efforts of this group and others to try and sort of shrink costs sufficiently to at least limit the cash burn that we're seeing. Chris, I'm terribly sorry. I have to.
No, that was the last question, Brian.
Right. Okay.
No worries. So it's we're right on time. Thank you very much for participating on this, and we hope to see you next year sometime. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you, Brian. So with this, thank you. Please post your questions to the chat box that there is on the webinar function. So we can go through your questions. We have Daniel and Geraldine that are screening and passing the questions to us. And with this, we will move on to our next presenter, who is Hannes, our chairman from the group, and he will provide to us all his insights and how his group is doing through the crisis. Hannes, all yours. Thank you for participating.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's always good to speak after the native speaking chief economist, but I do my very best. So also welcome from my side to my short presentation. Thanks, Geraldine. So I'm going to use one slide apart from Eurowings as the chairman of the MCTG. I saw we have a lot of attendees. Those who visited conferences before know what will follow now. So we are called Maintenance Cost Technical Group. It's a group we consist of airlines, OEMs, and other delegates, and we're supported by IATA. And our mission is to be the focal point on commercial airline maintenance costs for the purpose of cost management and benchmarking. So there are like two things we are famous for. First of all, the benchmarking. So the tool set most of you may have seen yet. So we are collecting maintenance cost data year per year and offering airlines to get a report on it, and even a personalized report if you take part in the benchmark, which gives you the unique possibility to compare your maintenance costs and to set this maintenance cost in some kind of comparison. The second thing, we are known for our conferences. This year, it's the first online conference. My heart is bleeding not to see you all face to face. It's really hard, but I think we have some advantages. First of all, I think we have a high number of attendees because there's no travel restrictions. And the second one, of course, we are not hungover from the cocktail reception last night, so that's also an advantage. So next slide, please. Yeah, something on Eurowings. Who are we? We are a European point-to-point airline. We are 100% subsidiary of Lufthansa Group. We operate a fleet of around 100 aircrafts, all A320 families. As you see on the right side, this is one of our aircrafts with a special livery, which I really like because it's my favorite football team. We served around 28 million passengers in 2019 and employ around 3,000 people. Geraldine asked us all to show you how we performed before the crisis and during the crisis. So yeah, it's horrible, as you can imagine. So pre-crisis was we operated a fleet of around 100 aircrafts. In the midst of the peak of our crisis, we went down to 11 aircrafts just doing flights inside Germany. So we reduced our operation of around 90%. So yeah, next slide, please. So I was asked to show you what happened during the COVID-19 crisis and how it affected our business in the maintenance. So I want to do this presentation, I want to cluster it in 3 phases, which kind of go along with the infection rates inside Germany, which on the first side doesn't make sense because we are a European carrier, but it somehow resembled the situation in Germany. So I took this one. So we had 3 phases. The first phase was a so-called lockdown. So it wasn't a real lockdown. I would call it lockdown light. So the shops were closed. We had a limitation of group gatherings. So it was just, we were just allowed to visit to visit one household outside. So we're not allowed to visit another household inside. But still we were allowed to go out, to work out and to take walks outside. But of course, all borders were closed, so our business was affected heavily. Then we had a phase 2. The infection numbers went down, so we had a kind of recovery phase, which was also seen in the presentation of before. So summer holiday was possible. The European Union decided to open the borders for holiday makers. There were no quarantine regulation in most countries in Europe, especially Italy and Spain, which are the summer destinations of the Germans. So there was some business possible. We had okay June and July results. Of course, not comparable to anything before, but still there was a recovery. But unfortunately, now we see the often cited second wave also in Europe and a bit in Germany coming up. And unfortunately, a lot of people returning from holidays brought some infections. So now we have travel restrictions again. We have quarantine regulation for Croatia and Spain, for example, and that affects our business heavily. So if you go to the next slide, I start with phase 1. So what happened here? First, our decision was again, what do we do if we close operation? Do we park the aircraft or do we store them? What's the right option? We had all the business cases in place. In the end, we kind of decided to go for a parking scenario first, to make use of the first 3 months. It was kind of more something we felt was the right decision at that point. And as you see in the recovery phase, we were right at that point. So we were more parking the aircraft than storing them. Then we had to organize all the shutdown of the operations, which means finding parking spots, because we were not the only ones to try to find them. So we needed to decide where to park the aircraft. And it was the first indication that we saw how important the maintenance costs are, especially during this pandemic, because there was so much uncontrollable factors that at least we had a bit on grip on reducing the maintenance cost in one way or the other. So that's really helped us. Next one was something maybe you read in some airline. Oh, sorry. Go back to the first slide, please. Something you saw in the news, maybe we closed the Eurowings brand. So the AOC is still existing, but it won't take off again. So this was another decision we took. In our maintenance department, we did a closed cost estimation. So we collected all the parking related costs. So they have a good estimation of how much it was and how much we saved out of it. But of course, for all you guys in finance, it's horrible at the moment. So pre-year comparisons are useless and predictions are very hard to do. So somehow feel that you don't have control of it at the moment, which is not that good. Short-term work was helping us a lot. So it's probably a lot of countries have it in place. For those who shouldn't know it, it's a government program that you can apply for. So you can cut the working hours of your employees and pay them less accordingly. And the government is taking parts of the residual money. Is paying part of the residual money. So just to give an example, if I put one employee on 50%, we only have to pay him 50%, and out of the other 50%, the government is paying 60%. So it's a good tool to control the costs in crises like these, but also to secure the jobs, because if you apply for the program, you're not allowed to lay off staff. So that was pretty good. And of course, very interesting for me was just a new perspective, because in 13 years, cash was never a problem in Lufthansa Group, and now we had to get into this cash perspective. So we somehow turned from EBIT to cash management, which influenced some decisions we would have taken differently in the past. That was pretty interesting, especially in this phase one. Next slide, please. So then the recovery. So we were lucky that we chose the parking option in advance. So we had pretty short response times. So we went back up to 60 aircraft. So you saw 100 aircraft to 10 and then back to 60. We had to decide maintenance which aircraft to reactivate first to get the best cost position. That was something we did during this phase. There were always discussions between commercial and operations, of course. Commercial saw a lot of opportunities, but we still want to keep good utilization on the aircraft we reactivated. So we did more or less daily discussions between operations and commercial, but I think we found a good balance and had the right fleet size coming up for the summer holiday. And of course, for maintenance, with 60 aircraft back in service, we had to make sure that we keep a secure and stability in our operations, which in combination with short-term work was a challenge, but we managed to do that. Next slide, please. So this is the phase we are still in. It's the second wave. Again, we have to decide whether to park or to store aircrafts. I think this time we will more go for a storage scenario, especially because winter is coming up. The base maintenance waiting and gives another layer of complexity now, because we have to find we can't take all facilities. So for special occasions, we need a facility with base maintenance approval. So this is another complexity we have to face here. We somehow want, of course, like all of you, want to prepare for the future, which is difficult because there's so much uncertainty in it. But of course, we have plans how we want to operate in the future, which also goes along with some kind of right sizing of the fleet. As Chris also already mentioned, probably will get rid of some of the aircrafts, start with a fresh and good fleet when things are looking up again. So next slide, please. Those who have seen me on conferences, I like to keep it short. So what did we learn during this pandemic? The short-term work was a really strong and effective tools. First, to secure the jobs we have, because before we were talking about how do we get good people on board or how do we keep good people on board. So we can, at least to this point, we could secure all the jobs, but still control our costs. So we significantly cut our costs compared to other years before. So we kind of could handle our loss in revenues. We saw that quick responses are essential. Again, the 3 months parking in the first wave was maybe coincidentally the right decision, but the faster you responded to that, the better you were at the end. So this was very essential for us. And again, I'm always incredibly impressed how our industry knows how to handle crisis. So I was really, really proud of our employees because they were, okay, here we go again, next crisis, what do we do? So we were really fast in getting into this new mode, which is strange and again, unforeseen until this time, but I think we did very good again. Also this conference, how we switched to this web-based conferences, I think our industry is setting standards in that, and we did very well, I would say, and hopefully still do, and hopefully come out of this crisis. And maintenance costs, to put everything into a frame, because I talked about the MCC before, we saw that we had a strong stake in finding measures for this crisis with the maintenance cost. It's a big chunk of all the airline costs. It's a key success factor, but it's something we can all own to really get to the next steps. We have to do it as an industry together. That's why MCC could help. That's why I invite all of you who didn't attend our conferences or meetings yet to do so. You could contact me or Keith, for example, who will be the next speaker, but also all the time Chris and Geraldine, and we're happy for everyone on board. Yeah, with that, I would close the presentation. I wish you all the best for this crisis, that we all come through it fast. And I really, from the bottom of my heart, I hope to see you again next year, because I always enjoyed that very much. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannes, for your presentation. And then we quickly move to Keith Fernandes, who is the vice chairman also of the group. And he will talk to us from Australia. Thanks, Keith, for joining us today. All yours.
Well, thank you, Chris, and hello, everyone. Greetings from Brisbane. Thank you for the opportunity for me to be able to share an engineering perspective. It's a little bit different to what Hannes presented to you a couple of minutes ago. I've taken an engineering perspective, and I've used some of the operators' experience of what we have learned from grounding and parking of the Virgin Australia fleet. The next few slides, I intend to navigate through a parking program roadmap, some of the optimizing initiatives that we've introduced through our parking program, as well as some of the cost drivers that have been impacting maintenance. Since this is a maintenance cost conference, I had to have a slide on cost drivers. But first, before we get there, let's have a look at the COVID-19 status in Australia. If you'd move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I bring your attention to, so this is a graphic from the health.gov website, and it has a lot of information in this website on this page, but I'll bring your attention to the top left-hand corner, where we talk about the current status of confirmed cases in Australia. So as of the 1st of September, we had 25,819 cases. Unfortunately, 657 deaths, and recoveries were 21,498. If you move over to the right on the top graph there, so you can see there are two peaks. Similar to what you saw in Europe or through Hannes' slide a couple of minutes ago. The first peak was starting up in late Feb, early March, where we saw a rise in the number of cases coming into Australia. Some very strict action from the Australian government then resulted in a flattening of those cases. So we had a steady state for a few weeks after that, and we had the second wave that kicked in somewhere around middle of July and peaking towards the middle of August. Thankfully, those cases are now going down, as we've seen some improvements in the southern states of Australia. So that's all I'll spend on this slide. I'll go over to the next slide, please. Yeah, so the impacts of the COVID-19 in Australia have been we have had some very strong government actions very early in the program. So in Feb 2020, the early decision was to restrict travel to Australia from certain countries. Coming up in March, as the cases were escalating through Australia, there was an immediate international travel restrictions where all non-citizens and non-residents were banned from entering Australia, while any incoming citizens and residents were required to self-quarantine for 14 days. That led on also in March to the lockdowns that we've seen, bars, clubs, cinemas, etc. And then something unusual is what the states and territories also closed their borders to non-essential travel. So not only the international borders were closed, but also between the states, there was no travel allowed except for non-essential travel. And that's the condition that still exists today. The aviation industry impact has been quite significant, pretty much like you've seen in your parts of the world. There was a significant reduction in passenger traffic, resulting in a reduction in aircraft operational requirements. International flights were suspended and domestic operations were only on the cards supporting essential services. So Virgin Australia, like the other airlines in Australia, were also just doing, we had international flights just supporting repatriation, but after that was completed, domestic operations were just about supporting essential services, which left us with the discussion as to what we're going to do with these aircraft. Do we actually park them? Do we store them? Which is what I would like to discuss in the next slide. Yeah, so the parking was the storage. I mean, at that point, there was a lot of uncertainty on the parking duration. So how long were we actually going to park the airplanes? Because there was really unknown COVID-19 conditions and impacts. We had no clue as to how long this pandemic is going to last. So we took an early decision to put all the aircraft into an active storage program. So the whole fleet that was grounded went into a 90-day active storage program, which eventually has been extended to 180 days with bridging tasks. So if you take a look at the chart on the right, it talks a little bit about the differences between parking and storage. So if you look at the positives between an active parking program, so that is like a 90-day program, we estimated there were a lot less man hours for putting airplanes into parking and a lot less man hours for taking it out into service as well, or returning it to service. Materials, we found that materials were not available, but we had alternates that were available, but also that was well supported by the OEMs. So big shout out to the OEMs, the Boeings, the Airbus, ATR and Embraers for supporting the operators during this crisis, especially with deviations and helping us with the program. But one of the positives in the parking program is that it actually retains your aircraft and engines and APUs in a near flight ready condition. The negative items as part of the parking program were a pretty high frequency for repeat inspections. So the 7-day, the 15-day, the 30-day inspections. So you got to keep doing those inspections. You also require the skills to manage those inspections. So we had to have, even though 80% of the staff within Virgin Australia was stood down or on furlough, we had to get some teams back to actually manage the parking program. So for engine and APU runs as well. And of course, the fuel costs associated with the engine and APU runs. In terms of storage, which is the lower part of the graph, you can actually see that if you had made a decision to put it into a storage program, there's a lot lower frequency of repeat inspections. And once you're in storage, there's much less man hours required to maintain the aircraft in storage. Of course, the other advantage there is you can actually store aircraft with or without engines or APUs in a storage program. On the right hand side, the negatives with the storage program is that you have to actually preserve the engines and APU. So you have to go through a preservation program. So you don't run them, but you preserve them. There are different levels of preservations, and you'll choose that level based on how long you were going to store the aircraft. High quantities of desiccants required for humidity controls, and of course the humidity monitoring system. So that was our decision. Put it quickly into an active parking program, and at this point we're just about transitioning some of the airplanes into a storage program because we're just about crossing over the 180 days. So if you go to the next slide, please. So while the aircraft are in parking or in storage, we have to protect the asset. We have to look after the aircraft from a continuing airworthiness perspective. I've talked about this slide a bit in the last seminar, but I'll just kind of run through some of the key points or the key elements. And the first one is the risk management. So you got to make sure that we do a risk management right up in the front, looking at what the risks are, identifying those risks, and also implementing controls in place to manage that to some kind of an acceptable level. Customizing it to local conditions, so environmental deterioration, damage, and corrosion. I'll talk about that a little bit later on how that customization worked for us. Continuing airworthiness, a really important element to make sure you follow the instructions for continuing airworthiness for not only putting it into parking program, but also for the OEM approved deviations to maintenance instructions. The next bullet point there is about continuing monitoring for ICA changes. We had to bring staff in on the tech services side as well to make sure that we were up to speed with all the ICA changes, all the AMM changes, the temporary revisions, the service letters, the technical adaptations that were coming in to actually adapt our program. So we had to make sure that we had the changes in and then automatically implement the changes into task cards. Effective traffic tracking control is really important for a fleet of 100+ airplanes. You got to make sure that you have consistency in the inspections. So having that tracking, an effective tracking control will actually manage also your transitions in and out. We had quite a few airplanes in lazy flying modes, as most of you did. So they were kind of operational spares. They flew 1 or 2 flights a week. And then after a while, we put them into an active storage program or active parking program, and then brought some of the airplanes out. So we kept rotating the airplanes in and out just to keep them close to the flight programs, and also the repeat intervals. So your tracking controls will help with your repeat inspections as well. As I said earlier, 7, 15, and 20 and 30-day inspections just to keep track of those the intervals as well. Program adjustments to optimize your maintenance frequency. So we were actually optimizing our frequencies for engine APU runs. So we were running them at higher frequencies and even testing the fuel at higher levels as well. Efficient defect management. So make sure that from our perspective, early identification and rectification will impede deterioration and associated maintenance costs that comes with rectifications. An important element that we found was actually keeping the regulatory authorities in close communication. So we implemented a 14-day program where we gave them consistent updates on the parking program status, including all deviations and also any of the program issues that we identified, as well as adjustments that we were making to the program, and some of the issues that we were seeing, optimizations that we introduced for return to service aircraft. It was quite beneficial for them to actually be close to see what's going on while the aircraft were not flying, but most of them were in a parking program. So you go to the next slide, please. Of course, cost impacts. So what are the some of the impacts that we were associated with the parking program? I put it into 3 buckets: the parking maintenance, bridging maintenance, and materials and components. So the first bit was, of course, in parking maintenance, intensive labor requirements for entering and exiting parking programs. So we estimated about 350 to 450 hours to put them into parking programs, and then the exiting was about 300 man hours as well. The repeat inspections and engine and AP runs also was labor intensive. Any of the ICA changes, the temporary revisions and changes, airworthiness directives, etc., were coming in, were also requiring changes and labor requirements, and of course defect arising. So early identification, corrosion reports, and additional protection that we had to do. The next bucket was bridging maintenance. So of course we were happy that the OEM supported us and moved the programs from 90 days to 180 days, but that came with additional maintenance tasks. For example, the main battery replacement for the 77 NGs, as well as the wheel overhauls or the wheel inspections in lieu of the overhauls, as part of the bridging maintenance. And the third impact was, of course, materials and components. So we had to get a high level of fuel testing kits because of the increased testing for microbiological growth. Unscheduled component failures and associated repair costs. So we were finding, as we were taking engine out for runs, we were getting servo fuel heater leakages, IDG, air oil cooler leakages as well. So that were unscheduled component replacements. 5th stage bleed valves on the 77 NG. So we had about 20%, or still have about 20% failure rates on the bleed valves. And of course, material lead time. So for all the components that we had, high shipping costs as well associated with that. So those are just a breakdown. As Hannah said earlier, it's a little bit difficult to put that into perspective. We are running some of the numbers right now, so we should have some of that by the end of the year, when we can take a look at really what were the maintenance cost impacts. So if you go to the next slide, please. So it's important here that you also look back and analyze your program to find out what's actually going on and make optimization changes. What you have here is some of the changes that we've introduced as part of maintenance actions while we did analysis on our own maintenance programs for parking and what we did to optimize it. So this is in four key areas. On the corrosion damage and protection, we were getting early lip skin corrosion issues, as many of the operators have seen, and we introduced very early on a lip skin chemical wash program. CIC applications for all unprotected bare metals like the wing leading edges as well as the landing gears. And then based on where we park the airplanes, so bird and insect nesting, we introduced detailed inspection for the unsealed cavities where we had sightings of bird and insect nesting. Engine fuel and APU systems, so basically, as I mentioned earlier, higher frequency for the engine and APU runs, and also increased fuel testing to contain microbiological growth. On the flight deck, so for return to service aircraft, we introduced intensive operational checks, especially on the standby and alternate systems, systems integrity check, the nose call anti-ice valves, pack valves, and bleed valves, flight control, spoilers, and speed brakes, operational check. We found that when we were doing manual reversion checks, the spoilers, actuators were behaving erratically, so we introduced operational checks for those as well. Lights, so as the aircraft were getting out, we introduced emergency and cockpit light checks, internal and external lights, and of course loadable software updates, the NDBs and terrain databases as well. On the galley and the cabin side of things, so also making sure that they were ready for service, so ovens, water boilers, faucets, and coffee machines. A lot of water boilers and our faucet leakages that we saw, we were able to correct them before the aircraft got back into service, as well as dorsal blockages which we introduced with dorsal cleaning. At this point, I'd like to take the opportunity to actually encourage you that if you have such findings and you were able to actually do analysis and optimizing of your programs, I'd like to put you in touch with Chris Markou, because we are collecting data for a best practices paper. And if you are able to share some of what you have seen on your airlines across the world, it will help us as we create this paper to help us as an industry overall. So if you have that opportunity, just get in touch with Chris. Chris will send you a spreadsheet to be able to populate, and then you can help us as we, most of the items you would see are pretty much what we have introduced here. But if you've got something else that we would like to hear of, we would really look forward to hearing from you so we can update our best practices paper. The next slide, please. So this is actually a model that we've introduced called the top model. Now, don't get confused with anything to do with taking you on a catwalk. This is a transfer out of parking model that leverages the stop the clock calendar extensions. So it's a continuing airworthiness methodology supported by OEM justification and engineering assessment, and it's an optimized approach to repositioning aircraft to a maintenance facility. See, as the aircraft were parked around the world or different airports around Australia, we not all the airports had maintenance facilities for base maintenance or doing anything more than the basic repeat inspections for the parking program. So how do you actually get an airplane from A to B in a safe condition? So we introduced this top model that pretty much you're familiar about. I just thought I'll put it into a model diagram for you. So if we start on the left hand side with the maintenance due print from Amos or Tracks, which shows you all the tasks that are overdue, specifically the calendar task in that program. You then put it into a spreadsheet, and then you have a list of options in there where you can do later, you can do not, or a combination of the others. So do later, for example, the MRB or the MPD, we were assessed by our maintenance programs team, and we used the justification from the Boeing service letter for the 737. We used the Airbus AMPS or the ATR OIM that actually enable us to justify with a technical justification doing these tasks at a later time. So 70% of the tasks fell into the bucket of do it later. For the do tasks, so those tasks that were mandatory, like the airworthiness limitations, CMRs, ADs, life limited parts, or MRB categories 5 or 8, or out of storage tasks. So those we said we're going to do before the airplane flies. Assessment done by our tech services team because they're mandatory, accounted for about 10% of the overall task. Do not, so any of the operator tasks that we felt are just operator initiated based on reliability programs, we elected not to do those tasks, except some of the mandatory operator tasks like NDB updates, so we would elect to do those tasks. And finally, a combination that would require tech services assessment, any engineering orders on that specific aircraft, damage or repeat inspections on a particular aircraft, or STCs or service bulletins, which account for maybe about 20% in total for the task. So all in all, once you had the assessment done, you could approach for regulatory approval or special flight permit or your internal approvals as well, which ends up with a repositioning flight, enabling you to get it to a maintenance facility in a pretty airworthy condition as well. We've used this model for about 5 airplanes and it's been fairly successful. All in all, it takes about an hour once you have a maintenance blueprint done. So it's not really labor intensive, but it gives you a good perspective from the camo side on how you would be positioning airplanes from a non-maintenance facility. Can I go to the last slide, please? So in summary, so to just go through everything that I've just talked about. So in Australia, so we've had a massive COVID-19 impact. So early government actions, strict travel restrictions and international and state border closures, country fleet-wide grounding, including international operations being seized and restricted to minimum domestic operations, protect the asset risk management and continuing airworthiness controls, customized to local conditions, and effectively manage defect to restrict deterioration and associated repair costs. There's been a substantial impact to maintenance costs for the parking, bridging, and component costs as well. Analyze your program, look at what improvements that you can do to optimize for an efficient return to service. And of course, the top model, which is the methodology to reposition aircraft safely to a maintenance base. With that, thank you very much, Chris, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Keith. This is lots of useful information, I think, for people. You gave us so much to digest here. Always we appreciate your inputs. And with this, we go on with Thanos Pascalis. Also a reminder, if you have any questions, please post them on the chat box so we can screen and we can ask the panelists at the end of the presentations. Thanos, it's all yours now.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we're at different parts of the world. It's good to be here, unfortunately via web, but that's the days this year. Anyway, so let's have a look at a regional airline response. We're a small airline, nothing compared to what Keith and Hannah spoke earlier. We're much smaller. So let's have a look at how we dealt with COVID. Going back to the last few months of 2019. We were looking at a fantastic 2020. In December, we were about 20%, actually 40% higher in our bookings than the year before, and everything was looking super for 2020. Then New Year's Eve came 2019. Someone probably jinxed it. Someone, and probably one of us, jinxed it and ruined 2020 for us. So what actually happened? COVID started impacting Europe, I'd say, in February. Geraldine, we can move to the next slide. Thank you. And what we actually saw, we saw lockdowns, we saw border closures, traffic bans, and a total collapse in passenger numbers. What you see on the right-hand side is an actual picture during the lockdown of Athens airport, where there's actually no one around. And what we actually dealt with at that time was totally unprecedented. Our traffic fell in the 3 months, April, May, and June, about nearly 100%. And during the following months, we are about 95% down compared to the previous years. Let's look at COVID in Greece. Basically, we have 12,000 cases in total and about 290 deaths, of which the average age of the deceased is about 79 years old. So you just get a picture of what's been going on in Greece. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, you see a much more present picture that came from Ryanair, where they're offering 1 million seats at €5. Not much to be said about what's going on today. That's about a coffee and a half in Greece. I don't know, obviously, what happens at other parts, but not much. Our markets, Russia, which is our main market, was closed and is still closed. We're very close to getting a very slight opening. Ukraine was closed, Serbia was closed, Poland and Romania were closed. We got some openings and closures, and I must say that here we have a totally uncoordinated response to this global crisis, which was both from the world, more or less, countries and leaders, and in Europe. So we're totally disappointed with how Europe has dealt with it up to date, and we're still totally fragmented. People are opening and closing markets just by a minute's notice. In fact, we had yesterday the UK banning, I think, 7 or 8 Greek islands. That causes a huge disruption in planning processes, and I think that has been mentioned before. Geraldine, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what did we do as Ellinair? We are a small airline. Let's look at our fleet for 2020 was supposed to be 7 aircraft. What we ended up with is 4 aircraft, and what we did, we returned 1 aircraft early to the lessor. We managed to do that in about 15 or 20 days in March when the crisis first hit. We actually cancelled 1 other A320, and we also managed to defer 1. So we reduced down from 7 aircraft down to 4. Of course, we used the furlough scheme, which the government offered. So all our staff went on furlough. We stopped any summer hiring. Normally, we double our more or less staff in the summer. That stopped totally. And we stopped all trainings, which was both cabin crew and flight crew. I must stress there that as far as we are concerned, we've got no further help from the government apart from the furlough scheme. So things are extremely tight. The next thing we did, obviously, was a huge effort to preserve cash, to stop payments. And just to give you an example, in April, our revenue was €47. That was one person who actually bought a ticket, and I think I give him a lot of praise for doing that. So the next step was to continue to work with our suppliers. Some of them responded pretty well, and some of them did not. And I think that's a big lesson in the aviation industry, to know who is really with you and who supports what is being done. And as we say, is in the same, more or less, bucket with us. Going ahead with the 4 aircraft, we couldn't leave them at our base airport, which is a pity because our base airport refused to reduce the landing fees, and we're still in dispute with them over that. So we took 3 out of 4 aircraft and took them to Alexandroupolis Airport, which is another airport about 10 minutes away flight. But that causes a fair amount of hassle in actually trying to maintain the aircraft and supporting 1 aircraft here and 3 aircraft in Alexandroupolis. While at storage, we had basically 2 problems. One of them was the nesting of birds. Geraldine, we can go to the next slide, please. And the second was spurious warnings we got while the aircraft obviously were in parking or storage. Here you see an example where we got a warning of engine 1 and engine 2 compressor vanes, and the actual captain got that in flight, so it's quite scary. You can see the post-flight report on the left. It's actual, and this second, the picture is from the second time it reappeared when at idle. This actually disappeared after that, but we had these kind of issues again and again. So our basic engineering issues were nesting and spurious warnings. Next slide, please. So I think the difficulty, specifically when you're a small airline, is what to do and what kind of insight you have in the near future. And in fact, with COVID, we had none. So obviously our first decision was to decide whether we're going to do short-term or long-term storage. Our decision was to do short-term, i.e. Parking. We found that that would have been easier to manage, and obviously we didn't know when the crisis would finish. In fact, we were hopeful, because Greece did pretty well in its initial COVID response, that things would get better, and we were proven wrong on this front. In the end of the day, we kind of had to do a cost-benefit analysis for every single flight, or for every single situation that occurred. What are the issues that we had to tackle? Number one is insurance. For instance, when we have the aircraft on the ground, we're on ground risks only. So obviously, to take it out of that, we'd have to assess how much profit you would make in order for that to make it worth its while. We had to look into cargo ops. Was it worth us taking the seats out of an aircraft? Where would we store them? We don't have our own hangar. How would we deal with that? What would the manufacturer costs be, the Airbus cost in getting permission, and what kind of work we would get through, and for how long? Similarly, we had to look at labor, as most of our staff were on furlough. How do we maintain the aircraft, or how do we get them back and forth in and out of furlough? What happens if a crew becomes ill, or has got symptoms, or has been next to someone who has? If we actually lost the crew during the times where we were doing very little flying, it's quite a hit in your operation. So we had to take that into account. One or two other issues, of course: spares, commonality. Unfortunately, with 4 aircraft, we don't have similar engines, so we have to be careful not to mix and match, to assure that we have the same aircraft with the same engines at the same place. And last but not least, disinfectant procedures. And also, initially, we had some of our staff who were pretty worried at the beginning of the pandemic, and they were asking for spacesuits to enter the aircraft or to be able to do some work. We're still in cooperation with our lessors. It's quite a big task to be able to know how the whole pandemic will end and what will be the next steps, but I can say that we're doing well on that front. We can go to the next slide. So this is an actual picture of the airspace over Greece and Athens. We call it Athens FIR. You can see in the mid bit there that there is not one aircraft in that, and that's been unprecedented. In the whole of Greece, there's only a few dots which can be counted, but in Athens itself, during the difficult months, there were times where we had zero traffic. That's an actual picture from our ATC. So basically, we had to deal with the positives and negatives of flight versus non-flight. So if we look at flight, what were the positives? Running, of course, aircraft engines and firing up the aircraft was important, so it keeps everything running. Similarly with crews, we actually got one captain back this month. He actually hadn't flown for 9 months, so it's quite important to keep some of the recency up. Similarly with engineers, similarly with what we mentioned earlier with keeping the wildlife out of your aircraft, keep all staff energized, and last but not least, again, when you're flying, you would fly direct because air traffic was low, so you could get from A to B pretty fast and burn less fuel. What are the negative bits of flying? Here we have an increased element of care getting in and out of storage. We have the difficulty of what happens if someone becomes positive on COVID, increased workload on procedures to actually handle that, from booking engines all the way through to handling the aircraft and the passengers, and the probable financial loss. I think that's more or less about it. I think I had been asked from Chris and General Dean what we would have done different if we'd known. So I have 2 things to say. Number 1, I would have worked for Amazon and not an airline. And number 2, we would be canceling more flights in advance. We were too optimistic in keeping the schedule or trying to keep the schedule alive. That's all from me. Geraldine, last slide. And obviously it says it by itself, being prepared for 2020 and what actually happened. Thank you all, and keep safe.
Thank you very much, Thanos, for your presentation. And with this, I'll turn over to Swaran Sidhu from EasyJet to give us his perspective from a different size airline. Swaran, all yours, and thanks for participating.
Oh, hello, thank you. It's great to join the MCC again, albeit in different circumstances. So good afternoon from the UK to everybody who is on the webinar today and listening to the seminar. And in fact, Thanos, I love that picture of the armor, and I think I may want to borrow that by the time we come out of this pandemic. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there's something about us is all about pre-COVID-19. As you can see that our model is pretty much still the same. We are a European point-to-point short-haul airline. We have low cost, and it's all intra-European in terms of our network and in terms of ambition. We certainly want to be Europe's most preferred short-haul airline. And ensuring that our returns are market leading. And we are very, very much into our customer, like any other airline would be, and we make our biggest effort to ensure we seamlessly connect up Europe with a proper and a warmer smile in the sky. As you can see, our fleet was pre-COVID 330 aircraft in 19, and we had flown a huge number of passengers, 90 million plus passengers. We had over 1,000 routes and more than 40 bases, and our fleet consists of 321 neos, 320 neos, 320 CEOs, and the 319. And the top right hand corner is the dotted part of the European map that you can see pre-COVID, and albeit a bit sized to fit the screen, but actually there are loads of dots in there pre-COVID. So next slide, please. And so to give you a kind of perspective on the UK, how the pandemic has impacted everybody in terms of numbers, and you can see that from the early part of the year, whilst the pandemic was, in my view, quietly creeping in without our knowledge, and I think, as mentioned by the previous speakers, in the early stages of the pandemic, the reluctance to accept that this is going to be a major pandemic, and that this is going to be short-lived. But unfortunately, we were proven otherwise, and from April that you can see the cases in the UK rose significantly, and the action was lagging somewhat compared to some parts of Europe in terms of lockdown. So the lockdown started in April, and as you can see, the cases rose significantly from April, peaking over 6,000 per day, and then coming down, once the lockdown started to take effect. And it kind of stabilized between, June and July. And when the lockdown started to be eased, we are starting to see the creep up again. And then, of course, there's always the danger of a second wave, as everybody is, not predicting so much, but talking about it. When we say predicting, it's so hard to predict anything these days in this pandemic. So the last snapshot I can give you is just under 3,000 cases in the UK. That consists of the United Kingdom of London, Scotland, and England, Scotland, and Wales, and Northern Ireland. So albeit the cases, England leading the pack in terms of number of cases. I mean, in total cases to date, there have been 353,000 cases in the United Kingdom, with over 42,000 deaths, and so of scale that we are seeing. So if you go in the next slide, and that's the kind of post COVID comparator. I can tell you where we are on our flights. Now, if you look at the chart here in March, as you can see, seasonally we start to creep up towards the back end of winter to maximum flying, or towards our 100% of flying of the network. And as you can see, that seasonally it starts to drop in the winter. But then, of course, towards the very beginning of February, then we saw that sharp decline, on sectors. Now that is the point where everybody was deciding, what do we need to do, and should we continue flying parts of the operation? Should we ground the entire fleet? That was a very difficult decision. And one of the key things for any airlines is forward bookings and cash preservation. And when your forward bookings start to dry up, now that's a pretty frightening scenario. And I think every airline must be or have felt the same. And I've, in my 40 years, not seen anything like this where you see bookings dry up. And so that was pretty scary. And that kind of drove decisions in whether you would want to ground the entire fleet, or you want to continue flying part of it. And of course, on top of that is cash preservation, which I'll talk a little bit about later in some of another slide. But that was partially the decision, and that then grounded a fleet between April and June before we started flying again towards the back end of May. And parking itself, in my previous seminar, I had taken you through the challenges that we faced. That was a new learning for us. And of course, we have done a great wash up on that. I'm pretty certain if something like this happens again, we will be looking at it differently. But it's always, hindsight is a great, wonderful thing, but the important thing is to learn from it. So could we move into the next slide, please? And that's the operational fleet. As you can see, that matches the sectors. And from a peak of 300 and nearly 30 aircraft flying, there was a drop in January alone, coming down very, very sharply. And then you can see the park period all the way during that time. And we were really struggling, but it was a major challenge in looking after 330 parked aircraft, trying to make a decision between parking and storage. What would be the best solution or strategy be? And combined with the fact that there are people involved, MROs, your own staff, trying to protect them, as well from this dreadful disease. And putting all that into perspective, how and what was the best way to maintain this fleet while it was parked. So if you go to the next slide, please. So I'll show you a little bit of in-depth analysis of our maintenance input. So I think whilst on my previous slides I showed you the aircraft and the sectors were significantly impacted, maintenance didn't stop. Aircraft have to be maintained, whether they are parked, whether they are stored, or whether they are flying. And in fact, maintaining aircraft in parked and a storage condition is far more challenging than when aircraft are flying. And if you look at the top graph in this slide, it is showing you the blue line where it says line maintenance. So line maintenance was the one that was impacted clearly, because if you're not flying so much, other than the doing the parked maintenance, you're not looking at aircraft that have defects that you're dealing with, operational defect or turnarounds, engineers meeting, or in fact even changing parts for defects or things like that, that you take opportunities during turnarounds when there's time. And slowly but surely, as the operations started to scale up, towards the back end of May and June and July, August, the line maintenance activity also started to creep up as well. Now, you got to remember that the MROs equally, especially the line stations, would be, had stood down people too. They equally are trying to preserve cash as well. And then when you're introducing your aircraft into operation, whether let's say you have a base of 20 aircraft and you only want to fly 7, they have to get the same number of people up and running again, the facilities opened up, the spares provision being in place, so there's the cost far kind of outstrips the the number of aircraft that you have there. So you have to be really careful you manage that without increasing your maintenance costs, significantly. And when you break it down further, the red line and the green line, that's your what we call the light-based maintenance. For those who are not familiar with our maintenance program, we have equalized maintenance and we have block maintenance as well. So the LBM stands for light-based maintenance. That's the equalized maintenance portion of our fleet, and then base maintenance is our block maintenance part of our fleet. And I've broken it down further in the lower part of the slide, where the graph shows the difference between the LBM and the base maintenance. So you can see, in essence, really, the activity in light-based maintenance and base maintenance was pretty much, the same, where because you still have calendar tasks to do, and we were already in the winter, mode of carrying out heavy maintenance on our 6-year, 12-year checks, and those, of course, that are on block maintenance, 10-year, 8 years, 10-year checks as well. Now, of course, there were benefits, or at least not benefits, opportunities given by the manufacturer, like the Pearce, for example, where you could defer your checks, but we didn't see that great benefit in some of them. Where there was, in some cases it was, and particularly where equalized maintenance is concerned, that it can cause you problems when you want to bring it back into your program, because there are bridging items to be taken care of. So again, that's balancing your maintenance costs, ensuring that you have the best optimized maintenance solution for yourselves, or in fact your planning strategy to ensure that you balance your maintenance cost. So if you take to the next slide, please, John Dean. This is a kind of a bit more in-depth analysis. There are a lot of lines there for you to look at, but I'll try and make some sense for you, because I must say it took me a little while to digest that myself. But what we really wanted to see was that from a pure maintenance cost perspective, was it worthwhile parking it up to 30 days, 90 days, or storing it up to 1 year? And so if you look at the green dotted line, which is the lowest part of the line in the graph, you can see that the man hours from the induction are very low, and as you go further into the period of parking, of course it will start to increase in man hours, but we chose that policy of flying every 30 days, parking up to 30 days, then back into parking again after we've done the circuit. Now then if you look at the blue line, that is your parking up to 90 days. And of course, some airlines may have chosen to do that. We did look at that, and again, when you look at the induction of that in terms of man hours, they were pretty low in the start, and then it slowly starts to creep up, and you can say so it's slightly higher than the parking up to 30 days. And then when you take the red dotted line, that's your storage. Now that starts to make a difference. The induction man hours of storage is significantly higher compared to the 30-day parking. Now then that kind of evens out a bit more as you go on the longer term. If you're parking in terms of storage of an aircraft, then it kind of drops down a bit in terms of scalability. But behind that, all this, you got to remember, there's still your calendar items to be done. So whether you're parking it for 30 days, 90 days, or storing it up to 1 year. Now, if you look at those darker lines, the non-dotted ones, so those are the maintenance program tasks included in there. So if you add those man hours for every time you do a check, you come to the top line there, all the lines that meet after the 330 days. And they pretty much start to meet up in terms of man hours. So in a nutshell, when you say to yourself, what is the best solution for you as an airline? Should you be storing? Should you be parking of up to 30 days, 90 days, or even up to a year? It really, there's no one size solution that fits everyone. I mean, we chose 30 days purely to keep partly the pilots current, partly to keep the aircraft more serviceable. As you know, the longer you park the aircraft, more kind of shakedown is required. When you're in a commercial operation, you start to experience more defects, you start to get more kind of environmental problems that are that will cause you some of these issues. And so I think for us the best policy was parking for 30 days, and that's what we did. And we have a number of aircraft that we did store, I must say, and there are only 4 of those at this stage. And right now we are still making a decision, looking further into the winter. It's not looking that great, and we may again park another set of aircraft, whether on a longer term parking or storage. A decision has yet to be made. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Geraldine. Yeah, thank you. So these are some of the cost considerations, that we took, whether, what do we need to do in this crisis? Clearly everybody preserving cash. Cash is king. Whether you are flying in a good time or whether you are flying, whether you're facing a crisis like this pandemic, and preserving cash is key. And every airline, no doubt, experience cash hemorrhaging out on a daily basis, because you still have your fixed costs, you still have your aircraft assets, you have your lease costs that you have to pay if you have lease aircraft, and your suppliers that you have engaged contractually to give you the services to maintain your aircraft or your ground handling. Several costs that are attached to running an airline. So all that had to be reviewed very, very carefully. And particularly we looked at our engine shop visit strategy. Should we kind of park these aircraft and delay shop visits, or would we continue with that and then utilize, which would be the best fleet to utilize? And so that was one of the things that we took seriously considered. And then you take the supply chain, and that was partly one of the key things we looked at as well. I mean, I mentioned earlier, when you were opening up a station to fly, you had to ensure that all the parts that were taken back by a supplier to their main hub had to be brought back again, because those stations just shut down and there was nobody who was going to be looking after some of the parts to meet your regulatory requirements as well. So they had to be taken back to your main hub of your contracted supplier, and sending them out was going to be costly as well. So that had to be looked at carefully. And then we had the end of lease activity we had to look at. EasyJet did sale and lease backs as well. We were handing back aircraft when they were coming due. So we had our end of lease activity has increased significantly. If this was pre-COVID, we were looking at extending all our leased aircraft by a further perhaps even 3 to 4 years, but clearly the pandemic changed that dynamics, and we have a huge end of lease challenging program in a short scale of time. So that's brought in other fresh challenges. And then no doubt that the EasyJet, like every other airline, did get government funding as well in terms of loans, and we did that. And then looking at the parking location, you have to consider the fees, where would be the best place to park your aircraft, and the MRO consideration in terms of maintenance. Could you get your people there easily, or were you going to contract out somebody where you're parking your aircraft and you had no previous MRO support? And finally, of course, your human resources to be considered. And like everybody else, yes, absolutely, we had to look at furlough schemes, which we did. And we had a significant number of people on a furlough on a furlough scheme, and then we had no option but to follow up with redundancies as well, just like every other operator had done. You've seen the news. I don't need to elaborate on that, but what we did, we had to take some very, very hard decisions. And it's always sad to see your colleagues, your friends, or some very highly skilled people leaving the industry. And I think going forward, it'll be very, very interesting to see how many of those who have left or were forced to leave the industry leave it entirely. And no doubt when the industry picks up again, it'll be an interesting challenge to see how many we are able to get back again into the airline. So we go to the next slide, please. And then I think, if you ask me about the future, I mean, where are we? What's going to happen? I think it's very challenging for every airline. You have multi-analysts giving you their views of various aspects of whether you're going to fly. Flying is going to return within the next 18 to 24 months or more than 3 years. I mean, my personal view is going to be extremely hard to forecast that. in the absence of, I think, the governments deciding to get together and come up with that real, standardized policy that allows, passengers to be confident when they come to book the flight, that they're not going to be, faced with a quarantine when they come back, because that's exactly what's happening right now. At a drop of a hat, you have quarantine policies being enacted in different states within the EU, or whether it's in the UK. So it's almost like a roulette game. Let's pick out which is the next country we can quarantine, and that's not going to give the passenger confidence. I think the governments and the airlines can, particularly the authorities like the ECDC, IATA, and everybody else, getting together to kind of working with the airport authorities and the government, setting up test centers in airports. I think that would be better served, where investment in those things will boost customer confidence again, will allow passengers to be able to test themselves on leaving the airport and on arrival, and get a test within, results within hours. I think that's quite important. Now, I'm not a medical expert. I know there's an incubation period, but nevertheless, it's something that has to be considered. Now, in terms of, I think the final bit, of course, is the vaccine. Everybody's saying the vaccine will help, is the key to all this. Absolutely. But as I say, you can read the slide itself. We may need Aladdin to come and help us out here in the absence of other medical experts coming up with it. I'm not underestimating the challenge of the medical service. They've done a fantastic job in trying to help everybody. But hey, we are in this very difficult period. And I think the next one is my last slide. That's, is that another slide, Geraldine? No, I think, yeah. So thank you, everybody, for listening. And I'll try to complete these as quickly as possible, as we were running behind on time. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Swaran. A lot of parameters that you presented to us with respect to considering before you store and operate the aircraft. And with this, we go to our final presenter today, Michael Hansen from Southwest. Thanks, Michael. All yours.
Thank you, Chris. I trust you can hear me okay?
Yes, very well. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Again, hello, everyone. Mike Hansen from Southwest Airlines. And we'll kind of thread the needle a bit on our presentation. We'll provide you some looks at the financial aspects of the company, and we'll provide you some macro looks at our fleet and how we've managed through the ups and downs of this crisis. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So this is a current snapshot of the outbreak in the United States. Safe to say the initial outbreak was largely epicentered around the New York City metropolitan area, which is the initial bump you see in April. That relaxed somewhat into the early summer months. Then we had a much more sustained and geographically diverse outbreak, largely concentrated around our southern states, but driven primarily in Florida, here in Texas, Arizona, and of course in California. The good news is we do seem to be on the back end of the downward slope, so positive news from our perspective, but still the case numbers are raging relative to our population. So a lot of work to do. If there's a bright light for the United States, it's really that our, if you look in the far right there, the deaths don't seem to be spiking as high with these subsequent waves, which is certainly kudos to our frontline medical professionals, and a bright spot in an otherwise bleak picture for the country so far this year. Next slide, please. So as far as a coordinated response at a national level, it's safe to say that there hasn't been one. So what you're starting to see really is more of a regionalization of responses to COVID. Primarily, it's driven up in the Northeast, largely due to the fact that the New York City area was the original epicenter. Hawaii and Alaska, by dint of their geography, were one of the first ones to really enact tighter controls. But as far as a national response, there isn't one. And generally speaking, it's traveling between state to state. It's much more voluntary quarantine measures that you have to take. It's much more on the honor system. So it's, which explains why we have cases raging out of control, and geographically the impact has been widespread. So next slide, please. So Southwest Airlines, what are we and who are we? Of course, much of our operation is focused on the domestic United States, the lower 48 states. We have had recent launches into Hawaii. They're a little better than a year old now. And post-acquisition of AirTran some years ago, we've had some moderate incremental growth into near international markets, largely focused on leisure destinations in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. From a positive standpoint, some of the recent news is we've actually seen our company go on the offense. So we've announced new service to Palm Springs. We've announced new service to Miami, and we've also expanded the footprint at Long Beach, which expands, of course, grows our LA basin exposure due to JetBlue moving out of Long Beach. We took over the 17 slots. So some bright lights for us in the middle of this year, and hopefully something we can continue to grow on, and really just looking to grow our revenue through the end of the year and into next year. So next slide, please. So this is a rather busy chart, and we'll kind of drill down on certain aspects of it. But what I hope to show is the progression of the sort of the financial liquidity of the company, starting at the end of 2019 and to where we are today. So if there's certainly many good things we can say about Southwest, but one of the areas in which we are incredibly fortunate is our strong liquidity position. We have $15.4 billion in cash on hand and an additional $1 billion in a revolving credit facility. So far through 2020, the net that we've been able to raise is $18.7 billion. A little better than $13 billion of that is, of course, debt and sale leasebacks. $2 billion came in a common stock offering that was announced earlier this year, and a little better than $3 billion in the first phase of the payroll support program, which was the government. It was sort of the provision in the CARES Act, which was the governmental support for the airlines. So to drill in on that, just for those who don't know, the payroll support program came in two phases. The first phase is the one in which we're currently under. Southwest was awarded $3 billion, a little better than $3 billion from the government. $2.3 billion was direct payroll support. Of course, that protected jobs until October 1st of this year, and an additional $948 million in a 10-year loan. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware of, the news as we get closer to that October 1st deadline, you're starting to see the effects of this payroll support program waning, which is why you see literally tens of thousands of airline employees facing furlough, job loss. So as an additional provision, there was a phase 2 that airlines could take that was not so much under the auspices of a grant, but more loans. And some of the provisions that were attached to that regarding share repurchases, executive compensation were a lot tighter and under the first phase of this act in April. So last month, Southwest actually voluntarily elected out of the additional phase 2 provisions. So we had turned down an additional $2.8 billion, largely because they considered it a competitive disadvantage. And again, that's just due to how fortunate we are as a company. Even though we've been incredibly active in the market, both in treasury functions and in equity functions, we still have about $12 billion in unencumbered assets, and about $10 billion of that is in aircraft. So we still have avenues we can tap into, and we feel the market will give us better rates and better provisions than the government assistance would. So a lot of words there and a lot of charts, but that shows you that the summary is we are incredibly fortunate as a company to be in the position that we're in. Next slide, please. So, of course, and this really builds on what a lot of my colleagues have already talked about, how did we manage the fleet? And really there were two vehicles that we used to manage our fleet during this time. Of course, we have the parking rotation, which we divided up into short-term and long-term parking, and then, of course, longer-term storage. So to touch on the short-term, long-term parking, sort of the parking rotation as an umbrella, we really utilized this to provide operational flexibility to our fleet. Of course, in the early days, there was, as everyone else has spoken to, a considerable amount of unknowns. We didn't know sort of the duration of this, when we would see demand recover. Was it short term? Was it long term? So the parking rotations became a buffer and our sort of pool of aircraft to be more responsive to any sort of rebound in demand. Initially on our storage partition, we used that for twofold purposes. The first was to immediately shed maintenance costs. And it was really just conserving cash was the rule of the day. The second one was also keeping an eye towards potential retirement aircraft. And we didn't know, again, speaking to the uncertainty, we really didn't know if we would come out of this with a smaller fleet, and if it was smaller, would it be dramatically smaller, or would it be maybe modestly smaller? So we sort of threaded the needle, and a group of those aircraft that are sitting in storage are essentially aircraft that if we had to get rid of tomorrow, we wouldn't miss. So sort of the two schools of thought there. The parking rotation was operational flexibility. Storage was cash preservation and potential impacts at a fleet level if we had to remove aircraft from our operation. And again, I don't want to belabor it. With storage and with parking, we've had the same issues from a technical perspective, a maintenance and engineering perspective, with all the same types of findings that airlines across the globe have had. There's really been no unique outliers to us. We're seeing the same things that all the other operators are seeing with their parked fleets. So next slide, please. So again, another busy chart here, but this shows at a more granular level of detail the ebb and flow of how we managed our fleet. So what you see on your x-axis at the bottom, of course, is the last few months, and two groupings of stack bar charts. On the leftmost bar chart for each grouping, you'll see what we had in the dark blue as our operational fleet at that time, and then on top of that, the aircraft that we had in our parking rotation. So again, early on in May, we're coming off the lows of the initial drawdown and the calcification of demand within the domestic U.S. market. So 226 aircraft that were parked throughout our fleet, throughout our operation. And again, those are the ones we tapped on first, as you can see, as we progressed along in June and July, as we saw that initial spike in summer holiday demand. Those are the aircraft that re-entered operational service first. As we saw demand really rebound in late June in anticipation of the July 4th holidays, we began RTSing some of our parked fleet. At the time, there was sort of a debate internal to Southwest as whether the returning demand was going to be sustained or was it a summertime pop. So we still left in storage in July some of those aircraft that helped us control costs. So we brought back the aircraft that were sort of required less onerous maintenance, if you will, back into the operational fleet. And again, we still had that population or the cohort of aircraft that were potential candidates for retirement. And of course, all along our 34 MAXs that have just been growing roots out there in the desert for quite some time now. So as we got deeper into July, we saw the reality that demand was once again relaxing. And we expanded our parking pool, again, with the same thought in mind. That really, as far as a recovery now, accepting a level of reality that although we did see a positive slope, let's say in the aggregate on recovery, it was more sawtooth. So we're going to see, with various schedules throughout the year, peaks and valleys, probably for the next 18 months, until we see some semblance of normalcy in our demand picture. This time we added also, so as we added our parking for our flexibility, we added some level of aircraft back into long-term storage. This was much more of a strategic move. The focus was actually less on controlling cash burn in the immediate term and a look more towards next year and even into 2022. As many may know, we have a good portion of our fleet is fairly old. So we're coming up to a lot of the fatigue-specific tasks, the flight-leg sensitive structural inspections. So this buys us some time with some of those inspections by pushing them out. So there are really a couple dozen aircraft that we targeted that we felt that sort of, in essence, lowering utilization or dropping utilization to zero would enable us to buy additional time to co-package some of these tasks into singular maintenance events deeper into 2021 or even into 2022. So from a net perspective, so this is sort of at a fleet level, this approach really enabled us to shave off about $235 million in operating expenses in our second quarter. Of course, a large chunk of that was due to the decreased engine utilization and pushing out a lot of our heavy checks. Again, the rule at that time was cash preservation. In addition, we saved about an additional $60 million, of course, primarily due to decreased spending on rotables and pushing spare LEAP engine purchases into 2021 and 2022 as well. So it was really successful sort of cross-departmental effort and probably becomes the model with which we manage this well into next year as we sort of I feel we're getting to a point where we're controlling our cash burn, or we're getting better at least, and keeping this level of flexibility and responsiveness in the fleet. over the next 18 months. That those are sort of our new trajectories as this recovery goes on. Next slide, please. Okay, another busy chart. Really wanted to dig in and focus in on some of the attributes that we looked at for a retirement aircraft, because it's not really so much a function of age. There's a lot of, and what you see here is really only an example. Of course, age is a function of it, and age is a function because as the aircraft gets older, you're introducing much more onerous inspections, not only within your routine program, but within your fatigue and structural program. Not only are the initial inspections fairly onerous, the repeats on many of them are quite accelerated. So increasingly, as you have an aging fleet, maintenance becomes a much more cost-prohibitive activity. So while that is a factor, that's not the only factor we look at. We also take a look at much more life cycle attributes. So unscheduled and scheduled downtime that an aircraft sees, that you'll see in that sort of top center scatter plot. We understanding that even though we have a group of aircraft that are biased towards older partitioner segment of our fleet, we do monitor some of the, well, I guess what you, for lack of a better term, you could say lemons in our fleet that are much younger. So there's many attributes that we'll look at. Again, an additional, we'll look at levels of corrosion historically. You'll see the scatter plot at the bottom right there, and just really getting an understanding of not only the aging impact, but as you can see, we have aircraft that we monitor that are much, much younger that we're having corrosion problems with. So as we manage our way out of this, getting a much more granular understanding of fleet level attributes, and not only in periods, in sort of snapshots, but over functions of time as well, and understanding different trajectories that our aircraft follow is going to be a key focus for our team going forward. And of course, we have some of the more traditional factors where we're looking at different levels of power by hour cost and major minor damage, some of the more standardized ways we monitor fleet and monitor the health of our fleet. And I believe that's my last slide, Eddie. So thank you again for your attention. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very insightful presentation from Southwest. We appreciate it. And with this, we are running our second poll. Please let us know from these 4 options here, what do you think is your main maintenance related issue preparing for return to service? Coping with the regulator, OEM maintenance requirements, second, availability of tools, facilities for heavy maintenance, availability of technical staff, or aircraft cleaning requirements to meet the turnaround time at the gate. Please answer quickly so we can review the results together, and then we can proceed. Maybe we have one question that we can go to, and then we will try to provide you answers to your questions by email. We have your questions and we will try to answer them, and all of you'll have the Q&As. So just a few more seconds. If you click on your response, select one, and maybe we can view the results, Geraldine. So 61%, 10%, 19% for technical staff, and 10% for the aircraft requirements. These are actually pretty much in line with our previous polls, although the coping with the regulators and OEM maintenance requirements has been increased from actually over the last polls from in the 40s to 50s, and now we approaching the 60. We're over 60%. So that's the biggest. The tools facilities for heavy maintenance, it's the same, about 10%. The availability of technical staff is pretty much at the same levels, although goes down a little bit from what we had in the past. And the cleaning requirements, they're pretty much stable at about that level. So with this, I think, although we're approaching the end, we would like to take one question, and I'm picking on Alan from Cathay Pacific. He would like to ask Keith from Virgin Australia if you can provide in more details on the intensive checks that are performed before returning to operations. Are they in addition to the OEM standard reactivation procedures? And how do you consider the necessity of those additional maintenance requirements, Keith? So if you can answer that question, please.
Alan, thanks very much for your question. So yes, these inspections, the intensive checks that we introduced are over and above the OEM requirements. They were items that we introduced based on our findings during return to service checks. And if you would like, you can email me at my address in the front of the slide, and I'm happy to give you AMM references, etc., and more detail onto what some of the alternate checks and some of the standby systems that we are testing as part of the return to service check. So I know we're out of time, but I'm happy to take your questions via email, and I'll be able to provide you with more detail or in-depth detail on that one.
Thank you very much, Keith. And with this, if we can move to the next slides as we conclude our presentation. So Geraldine, if we can see the next slide. There is the link with the one with the COVID resources. So before that, there is this slide that you could go to the IATA pages that you can find a lot of resources about disinfection, about airworthiness, many other stuff about flight operations. Please visit the site. You can download the information, forward it to people who may be interested in your airline. We're working on those, and you can please keep up with updated editions as we update those documents on a regular basis. With this, if we can go to the next slide, we conclude our presentation, our webinar today, the first episode. We'll answer the questions, we'll provide you back with the slides and the webinar recording at the end. And next Wednesday, same time around the world, we have the next episode. We're going to talk about specific cases related to the new circumstances, the transporting cargo in the passenger cabin, about aircraft disinfection, cockpit cabin, and also we'll talk about the fuel testing and biocide treatments that need to happen as the aircraft is parked or stored these days. That has added a particular additional burden into the maintenance requirements. And with this, I would like to thank all our panelists for providing such great insightful information for these difficult times for the industry. And also thanks to Daniel and Geraldine for being with us and helping into this. Hope we'll see you same time next week. And please register again for each webinar separately. Thank you very much and see you next time. Bye-bye.